Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation and the Star Foundation.
Oh no! Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, the war on drugs. Testimony before the United States Senate by the Federal Council of Churches. I quote, "In dealing with gigantic social evils like disease or crime, individual liberty must be controlled in the interest of public safety." Later in the testimony, and again I quote, "Traffic in these intoxicants is a social evil that must be destroyed. It means the degradation of families and needless inefficiency in industry." No, the Federal Council of Churches was not testifying in favor of the war on drugs. It was testifying in favor of prohibition. Prohibition was enacted in 1920 with the passage of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. It banned the sale of alcohol throughout the United States. What happened? Consumption of alcohol did decline, but only temporarily. A black market in alcohol arose, giving rise to violent crime and colorful figures such as Al Capone. And as for the hoped-for improvements in family life and industrial productivity, they never materialized. From hooch to hash. Today's war on drugs has been going on for more than 30 years at a cost every year of billions of dollars. Our question, simply this: is the war on drugs any more effective than was the war on alcohol? With us, two guests. Pete Wilson is the former governor of California. Governor Wilson is a staunch advocate of the war on drugs. Milton Friedman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Dr. Friedman believes the war on drugs should be brought to an end. The Economist magazine this past autumn, I quote, "If you want to see money thrown at a problem to no good effect, you need look no further than America's war on drugs." The war on drugs and no good effect. Pete Wilson?
Well, I would disagree with that. The effort that is being made is to contain drug use, to prevent the kind of dysfunctional behavior, dangerous behavior, the neglect of children, all of the things that come from drug use of dangerous drugs, whether it is legal or illegal. And yes, it's expensive, but I would argue that the alternative is far more costly.
No good effect, Milton Friedman?
Worse than no good effect, many harmful effects. We have been destroying other countries because we cannot enforce our own laws. The attempt to prohibit drugs has done far more harm than good.
Pete Wilson, listen to a few statistics. First declared by Richard Nixon, the war on drugs has gone on for more than 3 decades. This year, 2001, the federal government will spend more than $19 billion on drug control policies, with state and local governments kicking in another $22 billion. So we're talking about something that's gone on for 30 years and has a current year price tag of over $40 billion. The price of drugs, heroin and cocaine, lower today than it was 15 years ago. After dropping somewhat during the 1980s, drug use now appears to be rising. I cite one study: the percentage of high school seniors who used an illegal drug within the past 30 days peaked at 40% in 1980, drops to 14% in 1992, but has now risen to 25%. You still wish to maintain that this is a good investment for the nation?
Yeah, and I think the statistics that you are citing make the point that when we in fact actually engaged in a serious national effort, which didn't begin really until about the mid-1980s, for a 7-year period ending in 92, it had the effect of substantially containing the problem.
Okay, what about these distinctions? That when you have somebody who's serious about it, you can actually accomplish something.
I don't think, first of all, the most important thing is you're not looking at the real costs of the attempt to prohibit drug. The costs are not dollars. The dollars are the least of it. There's a lot of money wasted.
We agree.
The dollars are the least of it. What the real cost is what it's done to our judicial system, what it's done to our civil rights, what it's done to other countries. I want Pete Wilson to tell me how he can justify destroying Colombia because we cannot enforce our laws. If we could enforce our laws prohibit the consumption of illegal drugs. If we could enforce those, there'd be no problem about Colombia. But as it is, we have caused tens of thousands of deaths in Colombia and other Latin American countries. I think that prohibition of drugs is the most immoral program that the United States has ever engaged in. It's destroyed civil rights at home, and it's destroyed nations
Destroyed
abroad.
civil rights at home because of large numbers of blacks and Hispanics?
No,
and
no,
what
it's
do you mean by
destroyed
that?
civil rights at home for a very simple reason. If you take laws against murder or theft,
Right.
there's a victim who has an interest in reporting it. So if somebody has a burglary, he calls the cops, and the cops come and investigate. Now, in drug issue, when you try to prevent somebody from ingesting something he wants to ingest, you have a willing buyer and a willing seller. There's a deal made.
No one has an interest in reporting it?
And so the only way you can enforce it is through informers. That's the way in which the Soviet Union tried to enforce similar laws which tried to prevent people from saying things they shouldn't say. What's the difference, Pete, between saying to somebody, the government may tell you what you can take in your mouth, but the government may not tell you what you may say out of your mouth? Where's the difference?
The answer to your question is that they also enforce speed limits. Now, I might like to drive 120 miles an hour in a 65-mile zone, but society tells me I can't. Why? What is their justification for curbing my free will? They are protecting others in society from the harm that I would do. When you say victimless, drug use is hardly victimless whether it is legal or illegal.
No, I agree with you on that.
I mean, it's a tragedy. And the costs, where we do agree, is that the dollars are the least of it. It is the incalculable human suffering, the waste of human potential and opportunity. It's the crack babies. It is...
But all of those are made worse by the attempt to prohibit it. And look, take marijuana, for example. In thousands of years, there's not been a single death from overuse of marijuana. There's no evidence whatsoever that marijuana causes people to harm other people. And yet, six states now?
But there is extraordinary evidence
None,
that
no.
PCP, methamphetamines, and other dangerous drugs do.
Yes, and those
No
drugs,
question about
those drugs have been stimulated, and their market expanded by the attempt to prohibit other drugs, which has driven up the price of drugs that are less harmful than the substitute.
Next topic. Is it useful to treat hard and soft drugs differently? Pete, would you then be willing to decriminalize, or at least entertain the decriminalization of marijuana, and to draw a distinction between soft drugs, so to speak, of which marijuana would be the primary example, and the harder drugs, heroin, cocaine, PCPs, methamphetamines? Would you be willing to entertain that?
I don't think it's a good idea to legalize either one, but of course I would make that distinction because law enforcement makes the distinction, and indeed the law presently makes that distinction. But one of the popular mythologies is that there are people in prison for simple possession of marijuana. If you talk to judges, if you talk to prosecutors in particular, they will tell you that the people in the California prison system, at least, who are there because of drug convictions, were not there because of simple possession. They had copped a plea. They had engaged in plea bargaining. They are there because they are dealers.
Well, many of them are there as dealers, but again, take the case of dealers. Because of prohibition, the real dealers have found it advantageous to hire teenagers because the juvenile laws punish them less
severely?
Less severely.
Right.
When Nelson Rockefeller was governor of New York, he put in especially stringent laws on drugs. But the juveniles were exempted or on a lower level. And as a result, the drug dealers switched to using juveniles. The attempt to prohibit drugs is one of the main reasons for the destruction of the ghettos in our cities. I'm sure you agree with that, Pete, that if you go into the ghettos, the prohibition of drugs is one of the main reasons why the prisoners in prison are disproportionately black.
Well, I think this is a separate issue. I really do, because what you're saying is an indictment that is leveled by civil libertarians with respect to the criminal justice system in general.
Yes, it is.
And the answer is the criminal law ought to be enforced in a way that is totally colorblind. If it's not, it should be.
But it's not because the civil law is not colorblind. It's because the ghettos are a good place to distribute drugs for obvious reasons. That's where you have a group that'll protect themselves, that'll provide protection. The customers are not black, for the most part. They come in from the outside, shop in the inner cities.
So you have a relatively lawless environment where the serious dealers can set up shop, employ gangs and kids, and it becomes a distribution center for the white people from the suburbs.
Absolutely.
That's roughly. Could we engage? A crucial question. Would legalization cause drug consumption to go up? James Q. Wilson, quote, "The central problem with legalizing drugs is that it will increase drug consumption under almost any reasonable guess as to what the legalization regime would look like." Wilson then goes on to survey the literature. He finds that predictions about how much under a regime of legalization the price of hard drugs would drop range from a factor of 3 to a factor of 20. I quote again, "Now, take a powerfully addictive substance, one that not only operates on but modifies the brain, and ask how many more people would use it if its cash price were only 30% or even 5% of its current price. The answer must be a lot."
Well, we have a good deal of evidence to counter Jim Wilson. In the first place, remember that drugs of all kinds were perfectly legal in the United States before 1914, or 13, whatever. At that time,
the original Coca-Cola actually contained a trace of cocaine.
It contained cocaine.
Right.
You could buy it. And the level of drug addiction, by the best of estimates, was roughly the same as it is now. We have the experience now in Holland, where essentially marijuana is legalized, or effectively legalized. And the rate of use of marijuana among teenagers, among youngsters in Holland, is less than it is in the United States. There are all sorts of things that Jim Wilson leaves out of that account. But for the moment, let me suppose that there were, I'm not saying there would not be more users, there might be.
But isn't that the
people who
point?
would benefit most from legalization?
It is a central point.
The people who would benefit most from legalization
Right.
are the addicts, because they would have an assurance of quality. They would not be in danger of their lives. They wouldn't have to become criminals in order to support the habit. It would be a wholly different world for them. Right now, you speak about crack babies. Right now, women who are pregnant women are afraid, who are drug users, are afraid to get prenatal care, afraid to get care because they'll be called criminals and turned over to the justice system.
Milton, let me go back to the other Wilson, James Q. Wilson. I quote Wilson, "John Stuart Mill, the father of modern libertarians," I go now to the moral point, "argued that society can only exert power over its members in order to prevent harm to others. I, James Q. Wilson, think the harm to others from drug legalization will be greater than the harm, and it is a great harm. It will be greater than the harm that now exists from keeping these drugs illegal. So it is a moral duty of the government to do what it can to contain the problem."
Well, I think it's a wholly specious argument, because the argument for drug prohibition has always been in terms of the interests of the drug users themselves, to prevent people from becoming drug users.
Right.
And so far as John Stuart Mill's dictum is concerned, he says government may never interfere for the benefit of the people who are using it or are making the decision themselves, only for the harm done to third parties.
You may victimize yourself if you wish to in the government. That is not the government's business.
That's not the government's business. That's your business. You belong to yourself.
He is concerned about the user. I am far more concerned about the user's parents, about the user's child, that addicted crack baby, about all the people who are indeed the victims of the use of dangerous drugs, whether it is legalized or whether it remains illegal. And Jim Wilson is right. That really is the issue. How do you restrict the number of people who will become users and thereby minimize the tragedy?
Pete, what kind of arguments are Milton and Pete making? Moral or utilitarian? It sounded to me a moment ago as though we were slip-sliding from John Stuart Mill in the direction of Jeremy Bentham and the greatest good for the greater number. Is it, to both of you, merely an economic question which ought, in principle, to be open to investigation?
No, I think for neither of us is
that
it
is
primarily
to
an economic
say, if we're
question.
simply trying to
We've
say
already
under
said
one regime we have more drug users and under the other regime we have fewer drug users, whichever regime produces the fewer drug users is what we'll go for. That is not the case.
Of course not, because you have to take account of the other harm which is done in the process of trying to prohibit the use of drugs. Look, alcohol kills a lot more people than drugs do.
But you're nevertheless making a utilitarian rather than a moral argument. Drug use is wrong, and it is the responsibility of the government to embody moral values. You have none of that. You're not interested in that
Yes,
argument.
I am.
You are.
I personally
Right.
am opposed to drug prohibition on moral grounds. I think it's unethical. I think it's immoral. However, lots of people don't agree with that. And therefore, as a person who is looking at the argument and trying to make the argument, I have gone and said, let's suppose I didn't have that view. What would my attitude be then? And I say, even then, as I look at the costs on the one hand and the benefits on the other, I say that the benefits from drug prohibition, even to those people who believe it's moral, are far less than the costs. That this is that drug prohibition has been a failure. We've had 30 years to try it. We've spent tens of hundreds of millions of people. We've sacrificed the lives of tens of thousands of people in this country and in other countries. And what have we achieved?
The same could be said for 30 or 40 years. The same could be said of our approach toward the Soviet Union. We at least contained it. We had to live with it, but we at least contained it. And that in itself is a moral and indeed a practical victory, right?
It's not clear,
Absolutely.
It's not clear that we haven't contained it.
Well, now, wait a minute. Let me give you some
Okay,
statistics
Pete.
that prove that we did when we were making the effort to do so. From 85 to 92, the estimated use of cocaine fell from 5.8 million Americans to 1.3. Now, that's a significant figure. And I'm not going to drown you with other statistics because I think that one makes the point.
Let me make you drug czar for a year. How would you prosecute the war on drugs if you could reform it in any way you chose to do? What ways would you reform it?
I would do everything that could both reduce demand and reduce supply. Reduce availability. And the last thing in the world that will reduce availability and reduce supply is to make it legal.
Okay, federal money.
There is no question. I mean, I would ask Milton, what happened to the consumption of alcohol when there was a repeal of prohibition?
First of all, when there was a repeal of prohibition,
Did the use increase?
initially it did, but then it started going down again. It was a temporary increase. It's not at all clear that prohibition reduced the consumption of alcohol. And what is clear is that alcoholic prohibition destroyed civil rights. It's clear that it also led to adulteration, that it led to a higher level of deaths. If you look at a different question, if you look at deaths from the use of alcohol, they rose
During Prohibition.
But the paramount question is, if you are talking about a substance that produces tragic results,
That's alcohol.
it is also dangerous drugs, far more than alcohol.
Not at all.
Well,
alcohol,
we differ on that as well.
But look at the rate
And
of
I'm not
use.
here to
If you're going to have a war on drugs, should drug treatment be given a higher priority? $19 billion slated in 2001 for the federal government, federal war on drugs, another $22 billion among the states. It is certainly true in the federal government, and by and large true among the states, that the large share, the large majority of that money is devoted to law enforcement and interdiction efforts, and only a relatively small minority of that money goes to drug treatment. Rand Corporation discovers in a study, treatment is 7 times more cost-effective than law enforcement, 10 times more cost-effective than drug interdiction, and 23 times more cost-effective than trying to cut drugs off at their source in Colombia or elsewhere in Latin America. Would you, as drug czar, shift resources away from interdiction and law enforcement to treatment?
I would fully fund treatment, but what I would point out to Rand and anyone else who wants to argue the point, that most of the people who undergo treatment do not do so voluntarily.
That is true.
It is under coercion, and if it is illegal, they are under the coercion of the courts. That's how most of them get there. If you make it legal, do you want to take on the ACLU when they say, how can you compel my client to go to court or go to
I
drug
don't
rehabilitation?
I'm not going to try to compel him. I would not.
Well, and you know what? The result is there'd be far less in terms of a percentage and probably even in absolute numbers, people going into treatment if you legalize it than if you maintain its illegality.
Let's just grant that as a political matter, for a number of reasons, a war on drugs, a major and sustained effort against drug use, is just going to be with us. Let's just stipulate that it will. The question then would be, would you favor granting the government the coercive power to force people into treatment? Would you favor a massive shifting of resources from drug enforcement and drug interdiction to treatment?
Yes, I would.
As a matter of principle, would you favor treating the war on drugs less as a matter of law enforcement?
I would do
and
both. Peter.
More.
I would do both.
You would do more.
And that's what happened during the
That's
period.
what they've been saying all these years.
That's
We've
what
got
happened during
30
the
years.
period that we made significant progress on containment. Now, we're never going to achieve perfection or anything close to it. But what I will tell you is that it made an enormous difference. 58 or 5.8 million to 1.3 million in a 7-year period is a very significant drop.
Even that came at too high a cost, in your view.
Oh, yes, it did. But moreover, it's very misleading. If you look over history at periods of you have periods when drugs go up, periods when drugs go down. Without making things illegal, things can also be affected. Look at what's happened in smoking. Tobacco kills far more people than drugs do, by a multiple. By information, by knowledge, you've had a strong reduction in smoking.
So under the Milton Friedman regime, if drugs were legalized, would anti-drug campaigns still be effective? So under the Milton Friedman regime, that would not be a regime of moral laxity. It would be a regime under which drug use was legal, but that you yourself would sign up to join the anti-drug temperance society. You would want large organizations, probably voluntary in your view, to be advertising against drugs, to be speaking against drugs. You would want public pressure exerted on people to persuade them not to use drugs.
I think drugs are terrible. I think people ought not to use drugs. I think it's not in their self-interest to use drugs. But if people insist on doing things in their self-interest, who am I to stop them? What I have to do is to stop them from doing harm to other people. That's the function of government, as Pete and I agree. But I could do far more effectively stop them from doing harm to other people in a legalized regime than I can in a regime in which so-called illegal drugs are illegal.
Well, I think history contradicts that. Now, he mentioned the Dutch experience. The Dutch experience has not been a great success. If you look at the U.S. Department of Justice studies, the highest per capita crime rate to be found anywhere in Europe is in Amsterdam. If you look at the British experience, when they legalized it, allowing physicians to prescribe heroin, they experienced a 30-fold increase in heroin use. And that wasn't all of the use either. You asked a question a moment ago, Milton answered it, I didn't. You said, is the basic point that we should contain use? And the answer is absolutely. When Mr. Sterling, the director of the National Criminal Justice Foundation, was making his remarks at the Hoover Symposium in this past year, I believe, his concluding remark was that there was no question that the increased availability of drugs makes it far more difficult for teenagers to resist the temptation. Well, I can't think of anything that will more greatly increase the availability of drugs than legalizing it.
What happens under the current circumstances is that
last word, it's television.
teenagers tend to be attracted to drugs by the fact that they're illegal. First of all, there's propaganda against drugs which is so outrageous, which is so violent, violates what they know to be facts when they're told that marijuana would eat out their brains, for example, that they come to distrust all of such statements. And, you know, the fact that it's illegal is an attraction, not a deterrent. In my opinion, there's no evidence whatsoever that legalizing drugs would cause any major increase in usage. I think you have periods when drug use goes up, periods when drug use goes down, as you do with all other human phenomena. And I think that what you have to take into account is the enormous amount of harm that the attempt to prohibit drugs does to our system of laws, to our civil liberties, to human freedom. and that we would be more effective
Pete Wilson, you've got about
in
20
reducing the
seconds
use of drugs
for a
by
closing statement
persuasion
here.
and
Drug
by
use, legal or illegal, is a tragedy. If we're talking about hard, dangerous drugs. Drugs are not bad because they are illegal. We made them illegal because they produce tragic results. And the cost in dollars is the least of it. The human cost, the incalculable tragedy, the parents, the crack babies, that is the tragedy. And John Stuart Mill said that society has a right to protect the third parties from harm by those who would exercise their own will doing something stupid.
Pete Wilson, Milton Friedman, thank you very much. Prohibition lasted only a dozen years before the 18th Amendment was repealed. The war on drugs? The war on drugs has already lasted nearly 3 times as long. And as we just saw, the debate continues. I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.